Hello to every one of you and welcome to this channel. In this video I'll be exploring the topic of intrusive thoughts, and in general on this channel I explore topics of shadow psychology, or what some may call abnormal psychology. You will notice that the comments have been disabled as I feel this distracts from the message, but please feel free to give feedback using the thumb, and if there's any other feedback you want to give, feel free to send me an email. The socials will be listed below, and I've always tried to list sources that I've watched or sources that I might find that add to the topic or are informative towards the topic. So on to exploring intrusive thoughts. It's interesting that we use the word intrusive thoughts to describe this phenomena, because it's as if there's an intrusive thought coming from the outside into the person's mind that's causing so much of a disturbance, where indeed actually it's the person's internal dialogue and thoughts that are causing the intruding feeling. And without going into too much jargon of like what is pure OCD, what are intrusive thoughts, I just want to focus on the actual dynamic and the mechanism of what's happening when someone is having an intrusive thought. So I'd like to start by explaining this by looking at something that is more observable, like behavior. What do you do when you are uncomfortable? Think about a space where it is uncomfortable, like a work presentation, a new environment, a party perhaps when you only know one or two people. What do you do physically with your body when you are uncomfortable? You may find yourself leg bouncing, that anxious thing we do where we bounce our leg up and down just to self-regulate. You might find yourself speaking to a stranger and speaking in a high-pitched tone, or laughing a lot, or just doing something to self-regulate yourself, to ease yourself into the situation. And after some time, you generally start to kind of fit in or find your rhythm in a sense. So in the same way, intrusive thoughts, or we use our cognitions or thoughts to try and assist us to self-regulate. But with those who suffer from intrusive thoughts, what ends up happening while they're trying to self-regulate, when they are feeling uncomfortable or safe, they do this to the extreme. So how do these individuals use these thoughts, having this coping mechanism turn into something that's actually harmful or something that causes them a lot of anxiety? So let's take a scenario, for example, where you are meeting your friend for lunch and you have sat down at the restaurant table. And your friend begins to describe a scenario, and at the back of her mind, someone who's having an intrusive thought may feel that the friend is vulnerable. It's a vulnerable moment when the friend is opening up to them, especially when they're in close proximity. So they may imagine taking a plate and smashing it over their friend's head. And that's because in that moment, the closeness has made them feel uncomfortable, or they've become aware of how the friend can be vulnerable in that space if they don't pay attention or if they make the wrong kind of movements. So the brain then starts to experience these extreme ways of trying to escape that sense of discomfort. And then what ends up happening is the images of actually smashing a plate over their friend's head returns to them as though they were doing it by trying to avoid it. So people who suffer from intrusive thoughts, when they are feeling uncomfortable, as a way of self-regulating, in the same way someone may leg bounce when they're feeling uncomfortable or anxious, does so to the extreme, to the point where it's like someone is replaying a horror movie back to you, or the most extreme situations are being played back to you. Another example of this is when those with intrusive thoughts who suffer from sexual intrusive thoughts, let's say it's bath time and let's say they're washing their nephews or even their own children or whatever the case may be. And then they notice a moment of vulnerability where the children are, having their clothing off, and anything that can cause trauma can happen. So someone with intrusive thoughts will picture something in a way or in a sense of giving them relief to avoid it. But then what that ends up causing is further anxiety because now the mind has seen it. And it's actually not relieving or self-regulating. It only causes further anxiety. So, hoping you're beginning to start to notice that people with intrusive thoughts try and calculate themselves out of uncomfortable situations by trying to find relief, and the mind almost sends these images to them to say, this is what you're running away from. This is the worst thing that could happen in the situation. So this is what you shouldn't be doing, or this is what to avoid doing. But essentially, that causes them more discomfort, and they may sit quietly. And this happens in the background, and a lot of the time, people may not notice that they're suffering with these thoughts. So, what are the different types of intrusive thoughts? In some of the examples I used already, you can start to see that some of these thoughts can be classed into sexual, grotesque, and aggressive. And you may even go on to further say that the kind of or the types of intrusive thoughts you have are the things you fear the most or the things that make you feel the most uncomfortable. So essentially, then intrusive thoughts become coping mechanisms for people who are trying to mentally relieve themselves of discomfort from a physical setting or certain situation. But these mental pictures or ways of navigating themselves out of this discomfort are often maladaptive and, like I said earlier, cause more anxiety. And then I'd like to move on to another kind of intrusive thought, or intrusive thoughts of process, which is not necessarily spoken about and may actually be described as other things. But I'd like to think of these also as intrusive thoughts because they do tend to cause a lot of anxiety. So the two examples of process intrusive thoughts is suicide and addiction. So let's say someone who's been suffering from depression hasn't had a suicidal thought for a while, or bipolar and hasn't had a suicidal thought for a while. And then they are out maybe at a resort or something, and there's a high bridge crossing over a river. And whilst they're on the bridge, they'll get the image of jumping off the bridge, or at times an auditory voice saying, just jump. Or when they are in danger, like for example, let's say they're in a car and again, they're not particularly feeling suicidal, but because the situation is dangerous and it possibly could be making them uncomfortable, a voice will say, just open the door and throw yourself out of the moving car. So these intrusive thoughts, they kind of marry audio and visual, and they sometimes also trigger those people who've had suicidal thoughts in the past, although they might not be suicidal currently, but it's not a thought they invited in, or a visual or an audio thing they invited in. And then another one I'd like to also think of an intrusive thought that comes in when it comes to or related to another diagnosis is addiction, where a person hasn't thought of using and they've been clean for a while, but all of a sudden when they go past certain substances or see substances on TV, or maybe sometimes there is no actual stimulus in front of them, and then they'll get the intrusive thought, just leave and go call your dealer. Even if they're not craving or actively craving or going through a bad patch and slowly going back into the addictive pattern, but just randomly the thought almost pitches up. So for the last part of the video, I'd like to focus on what intrusive thoughts are not and who is vulnerable to having intrusive thoughts. So let's start with what intrusive thoughts are not. And for the purpose of this video, I'm going to nitpick a little bit when it comes to what obsessions are, intrusive thoughts are, and irrational thoughts are, even though they all fall under the same kind of umbrella of compulsions and impulses, OCD, anxiety. And the reason why I'd like to nitpick is because intrusive thoughts tend to be more quick and aggressive, whereas obsessions and irrational thoughts tend to be, I almost want to say, gradual. So let me give examples. When someone is having an intrusive thought, I'd like you to think of an intruder just quickly opening the door and barging in. As I was mentioning in the first part of the video, that it's as if the thoughts don't belong there, like they are there to completely disturb, and they enter in such a way which is intrusive, hence we call them intrusive thoughts. Whereas an obsession is something that appears to come on more gradually, where someone may start to be sitting in their room, and this is someone who would suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder with the compulsions, obsession and compulsion, where they'd be sitting and wondering, did I lock the door? I'm sure I locked the door. Oh, let me just go check. Open, check, open, check. And then, oh, but did I lock the garage door? And then go and unlock and lock the garage door, and then the kitchen door, whatever door that they initially thought they had unlocked. And then those compulsions or rituals take about an hour. Hand washing as well. Is it really clean? Go back, hand wash, those kinds of impulsions. And obsessions tend to have a gradual build-up where someone then eventually is compelled to do a ritual to relieve them. And this is why I'm saying obsessions may slightly differ from having an intrusive thought. Then an irrational thought, for example, is something like black and white thinking. So I need to be the best performer in the class, otherwise I mean nothing to myself, which is often sometimes interlinked with where people anchor themselves and their sense of self-worth. And that irrational thought then motivates someone to behave in a very extreme way. But again, an irrational thought, in terms of just gradual onsets, or in terms of just how sudden or intrusive they are, irrational thoughts do tend to play over a longer period of time. Whereas intrusive thoughts are, as described in previously in this video, quick, very disturbing, often very extreme, sudden snippets, images, visual, audio things of someone feeling or doing something sexually grotesque, inappropriate, or violent, something that they would never actually do in front of their peers or to someone, but the thought happens because they're feeling uncomfortable in the moment and they're trying to self-regulate using their thoughts and their cognitions. So who is then vulnerable to having intrusive thoughts? There's a lot of studies on this, and I urge you to keep doing more research. Watch the videos I've listed if you have not already. But in my clinical practice, I find that people who think in images and people who also tend to focus a lot on audio, memory, and are kind of finely attuned to remembering things that have been said or things that have been done, tend to suffer more from intrusive thoughts. And these are people who have vivid memories and vivid dreams, or find it very difficult to accept situations and let them go, especially if they've experienced trauma in childhood. But there are a whole lot of theories and research that has been done on who is vulnerable to intrusive thoughts. But there is a strong link to childhood trauma or other things related to not having felt safe in certain environments, and almost needing to always protect yourself or think of the worst to protect yourself in certain environments, so that you don't feel that you're not in control. So those are the people that usually tend to suffer from intrusive thoughts, from what I've seen. But I urge you to keep doing the research, and thank you for staying this long if you have watched the video up until this point. and I'll keep uploading videos again on the psychological shadow. If you have any questions, kindly send an email, and your feedback will be appreciated.